Hi YouTube. In this video I'm going to take you through a tax-exempt revocation case. This is Church of Scientology of California versus the IRS. This case focuses on Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code. Scientology was a nonprofit corporation organized in California, and it obtained Section 501 or tax-exempt status from the IRS, but that status was revoked just 10 years later. When that happens, a taxpayer can go to the tax court or U.S. District Court and seek a judicial redetermination of the IRS determination. That's what happened here. Scientology filed its case in the tax court. One unique aspect of tax court litigation is the stipulation process. The court requires the parties to agree to facts which are not really in contention. In this case, that would have included probably a copy of the IRS letter and Scientology's tax returns. The parties also agreed as to the corporate structure of Scientology, including a number of entities. The party stipulation included several different subsidiaries of Scientology or organizations within Scientology. These included the San Francisco and Los Angeles orgs. They were open 7 days a week and offered low-level auditing for the general public or very casual Scientologists. This was perhaps a gateway to Scientology. Next, there was the Advanced Los Angeles org and the American St. Hill orgs. These organizations offered higher level auditing for a higher price with better trained Scientologists doing the auditing. And last, there was Flag. Flag was the highest division within Scientology. And what Flag would do is Flag was aboard the Apollo. This was a ship that had the kind of a look of an ocean liner from 130 years ago. L. Ron Hubbard and his wife lived aboard that ship, so this was obviously a very important property. Flag would do the highest level auditing sessions aboard the ship. In addition to that, they would also travel to different franchisees and help the franchisees become more profitable. Flag would take a 10% commission on the increased profitability. Okay, so we've run through all the stipulations from the parties. What will happen at a trial is the court clerk will call the parties up. The parties' attorneys will hand over the stipulations to the court clerk, and then the court will receive those stipulations into the record. Then the trial begins for the disputed facts. So the only purpose for a trial is just to have the disputed facts decided by the court. So the court will receive testimony and documents and other evidence to help it do that. So the IRS attorneys and Scientology's attorneys put on their evidence. The court made the following fact determinations after the trial. Number one, it found that there's these other organizations that are not part of Scientology. They're called just franchisees. And the franchisees would buy the e-meters from Scientology to perform low-level auditing services for a fee. And then once the students or their customers completed all the low-level auditing, I'll say that again because that loud motorcycle. Once the students completed all the low-level auditing courses, they would be encouraged to go to American St. Hill or one of the advanced organizations of Scientology to take more advanced courses. So the franchisees then were a source of revenue because they bought the e-meters, but also they provided marketing in the sense that they encourage their students to go on to Scientology. This was guaranteed because they would receive a commission, a 10% commission, when their students took the Scientology courses at St. Hill or the Advanced Org of Los Angeles. Additionally, the court found that L. Ron Hubbard and Mary Sue Hubbard received salaries and room and board on the Apollo, which is probably quite normal. If you're a cruise ship captain, you would get those kinds of things. I don't know what a reasonable salary would be. That's what a trial's for, but it would be up to Scientology to show that that was reasonable. In addition to the room and board and salary, L. Ron Hubbard also received royalties for all of his books that were sold by Scientology. There was a lot of books. He was a very prolific author, if nothing else. So he received royalties from the books that he wrote. He also received royalties for books he did not write. So in other words, other Scientologists would write books and transfer the copyright to L. Ron Hubbard, and then L. Ron Hubbard would receive the royalties for those books as well. In addition to the room and board, the salary, the royalties, there was also a debt repayment. There was no evidence of a promissory note or other bona fide debt obligation, but instead Scientology at some point in the 1960s decided that L. Ron Hubbard was owed more money because of the fact that he created this religion. So Scientology began paying 10% of all of its profits to L. Ron Hubbard as part of this debt repayment program. And then lastly, and this is not a good fact for Scientology, in 1972, $2 million was brought aboard the Apollo in cash. And it was put in a foot locker or a filing cabinet, but only Mary Sue Hubbard had the key. Only Mary Sue Hubbard had the key, and this is $2 million. It's a lot of money now, but back in 1972, you have to consider 50 years of inflation. This is a crazy neighborhood. My parents bought a house in 1972 for $35,000, so $2 million was quite a bit of money. There's no evidence that Scientology transferred title of that money to L. Ron Hubbard or Mary Sue, but they had control, and that's enough to be able to do something with those funds. All right, so the court accepted the parties' stipulations, and then it also made its own factual findings. So then it was time to decide who wins the case. The main issue is whether or not Scientology, the Church of Scientology of California, is entitled to a tax-exempt status under Section 501 of the Internal Revenue Code. There's two tests to figure this out. The first test is an organizational test, where the court just looks at your organizing documents and determines whether or not you're organized exclusively for scientific, religious, or charitable purposes. The IRS conceded that Scientology satisfied that test, so we didn't go into it in any way beyond that. And really, it's not even a real test, because the IRS would not give you 501c3 status unless you provided your founding documents. So in this case, Scientology had submitted its articles of incorporation. Remember, Scientology is a nonprofit corp. So as long as the founding documents say that you're organized exclusively for scientific, religious, charitable purposes, you're going to satisfy that test. The more important test really is the organizational test. The court will look at what the organization actually does. You can have a non-tax exempt purpose, but it can't be substantial. So every organization, because if it passed the first test, it means you're organized for some sort of charitable purpose. But then we'll look at the second test here and see if you've got a non-tax exempt purpose that's substantial or not. Well, it's really hot. And you can have a non-tax exempt purpose so long as it's not substantial. That is the key. Just as an example, to help everyone understand, if you look at schools, most schools, universities have a bookstore. Their main tax exempt purpose is to provide professional training, but as a side business, if you will, a side operation, and of secondary importance would be the bookstore, and every school will sell you t-shirts and whatnot with their logo on it for some kind of fee where they make a little bit of a profit, but that wouldn't be substantial in comparison to the tax exempt purpose. And even if it were, the schools or the organizations providing education would probably argue that it promotes school spirit and it's somehow tied to education in that sense. But in this case, the court looked at L. Ron Hubbard's compensation. And keep in mind, Section 501 says you cannot provide big financial benefits for your founding members or your shareholders. Inurement is the word. So no net benefit, no net earnings of the corporation can inure to the benefit of some individual, such as L. Ron Hubbard. But the compensation provided to L. Ron Hubbard did exactly that. Specifically, the royalties paid to him for books he didn't write, the debt repayment plan in which L. Ron Hubbard received 10% of the profits from Scientology, and then the use of the $2 million just really indicated that a substantial purpose of Scientology was kind of making L. Ron Hubbard a wealthy guy. And basically he's using Scientology as a tax-exempt marketing tool to sell his auditing services. So Scientology failed for that reason, and they lose the case, but the court had more to say. Okay, so what I'm going to do right now is I'm just going to take you over to another building that Scientology has here in New Haven. This is, and I'll show you an Ideal Org building in Cincinnati in a little bit here, but this is supposed to be another Ideal Org building. Someone in Scientology definitely has an eye for real estate. This building has enormous potential, and yet has sat here for many years. It still receives a different kind of tax exemption from property taxes. So that's a little bit controversial here locally. Take a quick look at this. Now, as a second reason why Scientology fails, for some reason the court decided to say Scientology loses on a second ground, and that's public policy reasons. And what Scientology did is they had some L. Ron Hubbard policy letters and an organization run by Mary Sue Hubbard, the Guardian Agency, the Guardian Organization. They had an intelligence function, provided legal and tax and administrative services. But they actually burglarized government offices. And in addition to that, they stole documents from the IRS. Mary Sue Hubbard, in fact, went to prison for obstruction of justice. So these are some pretty serious problems with Scientology. There was another case that was decided about the same time, Bob Jones University. Bob Jones University lost its tax exemption for public policy reasons because they discriminated against black students. So what the court had said in this case is that the government's not really compelled to give you a tax exemption if you're going out doing bad stuff, especially committing crimes. And the fact that Mary Sue Hubbard had already been convicted is a pretty good indication of criminal activity. So Scientology actually lost on that ground as well. And then just lastly, Scientology made a constitutional argument in the tax court. And what happens in the tax court is typically the court is going to try to decide cases based on its reading of other cases, of the tax code, regulations, and that sort of thing. Sometimes IRS procedures, there's revenue procedures. But you can make a constitutional argument, and once in a while the tax court will entertain a constitutional argument. However, you can bring a tax case to a U.S. District Court, which is a trial court of a different type. The tax court just does tax cases, but a U.S. District Court in California might have been more willing to listen to some of Scientology's arguments. Scientology brought an equal protection argument in their case. They did just an absolutely terrible job at trial in the tax court in that they didn't put on any evidence. Mary Sue Hubbard didn't testify. L. Ron Hubbard didn't testify. The church accountant did not testify. Perhaps if some of these folks did testify, we'd have more evidence that indicated L. Ron Hubbard perhaps, received reasonable salary if you compare it to a CEO of a giant tax-exempt organization. But they didn't really do any of that. They relied really on a constitutional argument. Sometimes the law is okay on its face, but the enforcement of the law is not okay. It can be very one-sided. And perhaps a California trial court would have been receptive to that kind of argument. The evidence provided by Scientology's attorneys indicated that the IRS had its own intelligence agency. It infiltrated 100 different organizations. These are bad facts for the IRS. In addition to doing all of that, there was a file that was labeled subversives. And this file had notes in it just pertaining to Scientology and no other organization. And there were some comments in that file regarding brainwashing and Scientology being a cult. No other organization was treated that way. However, the court decided that these were comments and some actions from individual IRS employees rather than the IRS itself. In L. Ron Hubbard's case, his policy letters, because he was in charge of L. Ron Hubbard, because he and his wife, Mary Sue Hubbard, who was in charge of the Guardian organization, went and participated in either directly or just authorizing ransacking government offices. Those kinds of activities could be attributed to Scientology, but in this case, because it wasn't the commissioner or some other high-ranking IRS official, just sort of rank-and-file employees, those acts were not attributable to the IRS, and so the court found itself free to say that the IRS has simply made, just exercised agency authority in an appropriate way. That may have gone differently had Scientology gone to a California trial court. So here's the Ideal Org building in the Covington area of Cincinnati. It's a neighborhood very similar to what you just saw. This is definitely the gem of the neighborhood. Scientology, if they put their mind to it, they really do some wonderful things with old real estate. Well, I thank you very much for watching the video all the way through. If you want to, you can leave some comments in the comment section. Thank you, YouTube. Well, here we are at Scientology. Not the best neighborhood. Let's see what happens.